All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're opening up the books on a fascinating and honestly largely forgotten campaign of the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Now, if you've studied this conflict, you know the focus is almost always on the fierce battles over in the Coming Frontier Division to the west or the massive clash at Wolong out east. But what on earth was happening in the middle? There's this massive, unforgiving 300-kilometer gap right in the center. Today, we're doing a full tactical explainer on exactly that. The Subansiri and Siang operations. We're going to break down the brutal geography, the enemy strategy, and what turned into a deeply tragic timeline of collapse.
Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, the forgotten central sector. Then, we'll look at terrain as the very first opponent. Number 3 is the Chinese diversion strategy. 4 and 5 will trace the rapid November advances across Subansiri and Siang. And we'll wrap up with the command failures and lessons.
Section 1. The Forgotten Central Sector.
If we map out the overarching theater of war here in the Northeast Frontier Agency, you get a sense of the scale. Off to the far west, you've got Kameng. That's Tuang, Sila, the really famous battlegrounds. Far right, the east, is Lohit, where Wolong happened. But smack in the middle, taking up an absolutely huge chunk of real estate, are the Subansiri and Siang frontier divisions.
Now, there's this incredibly widespread misconception that this central sector just sat out the war, that it was totally dormant. But as we're going to see through the timeline today, that's completely false. Troops fought here. They maneuvered in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. And tragically, they died here. If we skip over this central piece of the puzzle, we miss some absolutely crucial lessons on logistics, economy of force, and frankly, the psychology of military command.
Moving to Section 2, Terrain as the first opponent. Before a single shot was ever fired, the troops stationed out here were literally fighting for their lives against the environment. The geography is just brutal. We're talking altitudes ranging from 3,600 all the way up to 5,500 meters. The snow line alone sits right at 4,500 meters. And the way the mountain ranges and rivers crisscross, it makes moving from one valley to the next a grueling, time-consuming nightmare. Plus, in 1962, roads on the Indian side were practically non-existent. There was exactly one motorable road in the entire area of operations. Because of that, troops had to rely 100% on air supply drops using advanced landing grounds at places like Along, Menchuca, and Tooting.
So the big takeaway here is that terrain was the primary antagonist. Just surviving in this sector pushed human endurance to the absolute limit, let alone trying to fight an enemy force. Keep that massive logistical handicap in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of the explainer.
Section 3. The Chinese diversion strategy. So, what were the Chinese actually trying to achieve in this wasteland? Well, it's a textbook example of economy of force. For them, Subansiri and Siang were totally secondary. The main show was over in Kameng. So they didn't send massive, dedicated armies into the center. Instead, they scraped together this really small, ad hoc force of maybe 2,200 troops, milking units from Shenan, Linzi, and Lhasa. Their main goal? Super simple, but wildly effective. They just wanted to tie down the maximum number of Indian troops in the area so they couldn't be sent to reinforce the main battles. Secondarily, they wanted to grab some territory to stake their claims. They essentially achieved strategic paralysis on the cheap.
Section 4. Subansiri, the November advance. Let's trace the actual chronological timeline now.
The Indian forces had these incredibly remote forward posts acting as a defensive line, basically tripwires across the theater. You had Asaphilia and Lime King in the Subansiri sector, and further east, Menchuca and Tooting in the Siang sector.
Here is how fast things fell apart in Subansiri. In late October, around the 23rd, the Chinese launched their initial probing attacks against forward posts like Asaphilia, forcing the Indian troops to fall back. Then there's a pause. The Chinese actually spend weeks building temporary bridges just to prepare for the main push. Then November 18th hits, and the main advance toward Lime King begins. And here's the really wild part. By November 21st, the Chinese secured Lime King without even firing a shot. Why? Because the Indian troops had inexplicably been ordered by their brigade to withdraw the night before. By the time Army headquarters found out and tried to cancel the order, it was way too late. The position was just gone.
Which brings us to Section 5, Siang, the Menchuca tragedy.
Over in the adjacent Siang sector, things were happening at the exact same time, but it ended in an even deeper tragedy. The Chinese plan here was ambitious, focusing on 3 key nodes: Menchuca, Managong, and Galing. They wanted to hit Menchuca hard,
then swing a pincer movement north and south towards Tuting and Geleng to trap the Indian forces.
The timeline here moves incredibly fast. Late October, they do their probing attacks, pushing Indian troops back from forward spots like Menigong. Then, Phase 2 kicks off. November 16th, a Chinese battalion pushes straight out of Menigong toward Menchuca. They make contact the very next day. And, just like Limking, despite having plenty of troops on hand, the order comes down to vacate Menchuca on the night of November 18th. By the next morning, the Chinese literally just walked in and occupied it.
Section 6, Command Failures and Lessons. We need to do a postmortem on this. Consider the sheer disparity here. The dilemma was whether to hold Menchuca or pull back. The Chinese column that showed up on November 17th, it was only about 2 companies strong. Meanwhile, Menchuca was defended by over 800 regular Indian troops plus 6 platoons of Assam rifles. They easily had the numbers. Yet command felt the position was untenable. As our source material bluntly asks, if a position becomes untenable before the first shot is even fired, why occupy it in the first place? It really highlights a catastrophic psychological collapse. Leadership simply lost the will to fight.
And the cost of that uncoordinated, premature withdrawal was absolutely devastating. 42. That is how many casualties the 2-8 Gorkha rifles suffered while retreating from Menchuca. And remember, that wasn't from a pitched battle. A small group led by the commanding officer got lost on a freezing mountain hunter's track. Many of them, including the commanding officer himself, literally died of exhaustion in the snow. The main party was ambushed later on.
Now contrast those 42 tragic retreat casualties with this number, 14. Across the entire second phase of operations in both Subansiri and Siang, Chinese records show they lost exactly 14 soldiers killed in action. Let that sink in. It definitively proves that it wasn't overwhelming enemy firepower that broke this front.
So, what is the ultimate takeaway here? The fall of this forgotten front wasn't a failure of the soldiers' bravery on the ground. It was a failure of the environment, the rugged terrain, and the non-existent logistics that choked supply lines. But more critically, it was a profound failure of communication and leadership. Decisions to retreat were made in silos without consulting division headquarters, leading to these chaotic, piecemeal withdrawals that cost more lives than actual combat. When leadership loses its confidence, the entire front crumbles.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Remote sectors require stronger preparation, not lesser attention. Just because a location is considered a secondary theater doesn't mean the enemy or the environment will treat it like one. When you neglect the logistics and command structure of a remote outpost, you're practically setting the stage for tragedy. So it really leaves you wondering, what other quiet, empty spaces on military maps today are hiding these exact same vulnerabilities? Thanks for joining me for this breakdown, and keep digging into the history.